Okay, hello, and welcome back to the Clark and Miller English podcast. And if this is your first time here, which it is for some of you, then welcome here. Good to have you here. So, what are we going to do today? That's a good question. Well, today, you may have noticed, is one of our red episodes. So, what does that mean? Usually we do blue episodes. Today is a red episode. So the red episodes are less directed towards sort of English teaching, English learning, grammar, vocabulary, that sort of thing. They're a bit less like English lessons, and they're a bit more let's sit around and stroke our beards and think about language in a more philosophical, more meta sort of way. These episodes are pretty good fun if you're a teacher or if you're just like interested in language and linguistics and stuff like that, or both, preferably both. But even if you kind of consider yourself or identify as a language learner, there can be a lot of interesting stuff here too. So today we're going to hear an interview I did with the amazing Chia Suan Chong. Chia has been on my radar for a long time because she is a sort of expert in international communication, and also she's sort of a big fan of something we call ELF. But it has nothing to do with Lord of the Rings stuff and living for 200 years or however long it is that elves live for. ELF stands for English as a Lingua Franca. So what does that mean? Basically, English as a Lingua Franca is when you have, let's say, for example, two people communicating in English, and English isn't either of their first languages. So it could be a guy from Mexico talking to a woman from Japan, and they're doing business together, or they're just meeting at a nice restaurant on holiday. Remember holidays? And they use English to communicate because the Mexican guy doesn't know Japanese, the Japanese woman doesn't know Spanish. And that's English as a lingua franca. Sounds like a simple enough concept, but the more you look at it, the more interesting it gets. And there is no better person that I can think of to talk to about English as a lingua franca and international communication than Chia. And thankfully, I got the opportunity to do that. So I did, and we talked for about an hour about all these things. Very briefly, I'll give you an overview of what we talk about. We talk about ELF, but not the pixies, the elf, the lingua franca elf. We also talk about this whole idea of English as people who speak English as a first language, like me, and people who have English as a second language, and who's better at communicating in English. And there is some very surprising stuff about this. We also talk about how to be polite in English, or maybe not like an instruction on how to be polite, but what it means to be polite. What does it mean to be polite? This is a very cultural thing, isn't it? There are some interesting stories that Chia has about an interesting case of a misunderstanding between Indian catering ladies and Heathrow baggage handlers. Two very interestingly different groups, and how language caused misunderstandings between these two groups. She also has some interesting topics on how communication skills can actually save lives. And we also talk about a little bit of a sort of teaching area as well. Are teachers prescriptivists or descriptivists? If you don't know what that means, don't worry, just keep listening, because it's a really interesting question, and it's something I've been struggling over for a couple of years when I first thought of it. And how teaching grammar, rules are not very useful, and how grammar reasons can be more productive. So there's a little bit of stuff there for teachers. And finally, we also just talk about how language can show us how different we are, but also how similar we are. Yeah, I know, stroking a beard, philosophical. But that's good. We start getting quite philosophical towards the end. I really can't express how much I enjoyed this interview because it touched on all the sort of things that I find most interesting about language. And I hope that you do too, because really, cultural differences, looking at the world and all the different people in it and all the different ways we interact with each other, you know, this is part of our humanity, and it's part of what makes us such an interesting species, I suppose. Not just having language, but how we communicate with each other, how we have misunderstandings, how we overcome those misunderstandings. Oh yeah, I really like this one, and let's just listen to it, right? Okay, so I'll leave you to it. Thanks very much for being here. Remember to visit clarkandmiller.com. We've got some fun stuff coming up, and if you're on our mailing list, you will be able to join some free workshops, some free Zoom classes. This is something we're planning. I'll give you more details about that next time we do a podcast. But in the meantime, enjoy this. This is me and Chia geeking out about international communication and English as a lingua franca. So, yeah, hi Chia. Thanks so much for joining me today for a chat about ELF and international communication and lots of other things, I'm sure. Thanks a lot for joining me.
Thank you for having me.
Cool, it's good to have you here. And let's just go for a classic introduction. Like, tell us all about you. Who are you? What's your background? What are you interested in? What makes you interested in language? And what things about language interest you? And your basic background, how did you get there?
Wow, how much time do you have? Right, my name is Chia Suan Chong, and I'm a communication skills and intercultural skills trainer. My background is in ELT. I started teaching English, oh gosh, how many years ago was that? More than 20 years ago. And I did, the usual, the CELTA, the Delta. I did an MA in Applied Linguistics in London. And for quite a long time, I was teaching at International House London, and I became a teacher trainer there, became a CELTA trainer there, and learned a lot about English language teaching, the traditional communicative approach to teaching. And then at some point, I was doing a lot of business English teaching and realized that my clients were interested in a slightly different area. We talk about communicative competence and the ability to get that message across. And sometimes that's not always about grammar or vocabulary. Sometimes getting the message across requires a bit more than that. It requires understanding the person you're talking to and what they know and what they don't know. It requires communication skills, intercultural skills, soft skills, in other words. And so the more I got into that aspect of teaching, the more I became really interested in it. And then when I did my MA at King's College London, my dissertation was in English as a lingua franca. And ironically, at that time, I chose that topic for my dissertation mainly because I was out to prove the ELF theory wrong.
Aha. So yes. Before we get too into it, just for our listeners, because we've got all sorts of listeners, from teachers to people who are just interested in linguistics. What is ELF? What is English as a lingua franca in a nutshell?
Right. I should let you, talk about that because you did your MA in ELF too, didn't you?
I did mine. So something we have in common. Yeah.
ELF is English as a lingua franca. In short, it is the English we use to speak to people from all around the world who might not have English as a first language. So to put it simply, if a Peruvian person is speaking to a Chinese person, it is unlikely that they both speak each other's languages. So English becomes the convenient tool they use, a medium that they use to communicate. So you see the Peruvian businessman, for example, speaking in English to the Chinese businessman because it is the one language that they have in common. And in a situation like that, we say that they're using English as a lingua franca, as a medium of communication. And interestingly, of course, when people use English with other so-called non-native speakers, the context is slightly different. I think there's less of a necessity to play by native speaker rules, for example. And when the concept of ELF was first introduced, it caused quite a bit of controversy in the industry, both in the academic industry and the teaching industry. And a lot of teachers got quite upset by the idea that we don't have to follow native speaker rules when teaching English.
Okay,
and I was one of those teachers.
Yeah, let's touch on that for a second, because this was quite a controversial thing. This idea that we don't have to teach English according to how native speakers, so-called native speakers, are using it. And this upset a lot of people, including yourself, as a so-called non-native speaker at the time. Is that fair?
It's a weird one. You know, people describe me in all sorts of ways. I see myself, if we have to use the terms native, non-native, which in itself is quite controversial, I've always seen myself as a native speaker of English.
Okay.
Reason being, I grew up speaking English. I was educated at school, learning maths and science through the medium of English. English is the language I'm most comfortable in. English is the language I think in, I dream in. So if someone says I'm a non-native speaker of English, I start to kind of wonder what I'm a native speaker of then, because I then become very lost. I'm put in this lost cloud of like, who am I? Where do I belong? So for the purpose of identity, I identify myself with English as my first language.
First language. And shall we stick to those terms? Because I prefer those terms like first language speaker and second language speaker, unless you have a better one, because terminology can be quite important.
It's tough, isn't it? Because like I come from Singapore, and in Singapore people speak multiple languages. So English tends to be the first language, but there are people who learn Chinese as a second language, but like myself, are more comfortable speaking English. There are also Singaporeans who might have English as a first language, but their home language might be Chinese or a dialect or Malay or Tamil. So it's a really tricky term, isn't it, to say someone's a native speaker or not, especially in countries where there are more than two languages. Take Finland and Sweden, for example. There are a lot of Finnish-born people, Finnish people, who speak Swedish as a first language and Finnish as a second. So I kind of compare it to that situation where when a country has two or more languages, like in India, like in Singapore, according to Catru, who created these categories, he considered people from, say, the United Kingdom, America, Australia as, the inner circle, people who really were native speakers, kind of. And then he put people in countries like India and Singapore in the outer circle, mainly because these countries had more than one language, one national language, which in itself is a questionable dichotomy.
It's already getting tricky.
Because then I would say, hang on a second, I might speak more than one language, but the language I'm most comfortable in is English. But then another Singaporean might disagree with that. So, identity is a tricky one. And the moment you say someone's inner or outer circle, it toys with that concept of identity. Nevertheless, people still refer to Catru's, concentric circle models, because we don't know how else to refer to these people. We don't know how else to talk about this issue, and it's convenient. It doesn't mean that we agree with it. Similarly, when I use the terms native speaker or non-native speaker, it does not say that I agree or disagree with those concepts, but it just becomes an easy term to use in this discourse to have this discussion.
For the sake of convenience, we go for those.
Yeah, exactly. Because to say English as a first language, but what if you have two first languages, for example?
Exactly, and they can shift as well. So, how about we go for native speaker, non-native speaker, but every time we're saying it today, we've got like quotation marks around them.
Yeah. So if you could see us, pretend that you can see us and you're seeing us doing the air quotation marks.
Means we're not fully on board, but we're going for it because it's convenient. So going back to the how it all started, you did your thesis or dissertation rather in English as a lingua franca because you were like, appalled, annoyed, or just sort of fully in disagreement with the idea that the native speaker model should be the one that we use to teach our students with?
Well, okay. I think when I first heard this whole ELF, concept presented to me, I remember I was sitting in a classroom, and one of my fellow colleagues, my teachers, came up and did this presentation about what he learned about ELF. And I remember half the audience nodding profusely, going, yeah, and the other half of the audience kind of looking angry and red in the face. And I was one of those who felt quite red in the face by the end of that presentation. Mm-hmm. And I suppose, if you have based your career on teaching English a certain way, correcting your students when they drop the third person S, spending time on making sure that they get relative clauses right, the difference between that and who and which, to be suddenly then told that, you're wasting your time, can come across like a slap in the face to some people. Mm-hmm. And then there's the issue of native speakers themselves, air quotation marks, native speakers like, British teachers or American teachers, who might feel perhaps that they are being insulted because they are being told that their version of English doesn't have to be the standard version, that their English is no longer the benchmark that we should be using. For some native speakers, they take offense to that. Mm-hmm. And I subsequently went on to write a book called Successful International Communication. And I looked into communication skills. I got very interested in intercultural skills. And one of the things I said was that, native speakers aren't always the world's best communicators.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Right.
This has been kind of shown to be true, not just from instinct, but the studies not all, but generally point in that direction as well. That
absolutely. I mean, the classic tale is of, and I say that the tale, but this does happen in reality constantly. We've seen it happen with clients as well. You have a board meeting with, managers from every country, from Korea, from Japan, from Italy, from Spain, and they're all sitting around talking to each other, and they're all so-called non-native speakers of English, and they're all using English as the lingua franca to communicate, and everything is going quite well. And then in walks an American manager, and he comes in and he uses his idioms and complex sentences, his anecdotal references to American sports and cultural references like that, and suddenly no one in the room understands that one person. No, I'm not saying that all native speakers are like that. I think teachers, for example, native or non-native, are very good at grading the language, at reading the room and knowing when their language is of too high a level, when they need to stop using idioms. Teachers are quite good at this because we get a lot of practice.
Have years of practice of getting good at that.
Exactly. Yeah. So the native speakers we're talking about here tend to be monolingual native speakers who don't have a lot of experience speaking internationally, who don't have a lot of experience talking to people who are not native English speakers. And you know what? Even within native speakers themselves, if you put an American person next to someone from Newcastle and they're speaking English to each other, one in American, say, New York English, and another one in Geordie English, there is also that issue of, I don't understand them.
I've got personal experience from that. As somebody right in the middle of those two, I've actually had to be the translator for the Americans, and they just couldn't understand. It wasn't Geordie, it was Glaswegian, but it was exactly the same issue.
I can totally imagine. Yeah. And so you can imagine that, even native speakers might struggle with someone with, an accent that they are not used to, they're not familiar with. What more, if you take that person and put them in a group of non-native speakers, the non-native speakers might feel a little intimidated, and some of my students would immediately jump to the conclusion that it's their grammar, it's their vocabulary. Oh no, I can't understand because it's my fault. Take, for example, I had a teacher trainee who walked into class and started talking about Heston Blumenthal. And the students all went sorry, what? And he said, Heston Blumenthal, don't you know, the very famous celebrity chef? And they all looked at him, this blank look. Now,
I didn't know who it was either.
Now, clearly, this is not an issue with English. It was an issue with a cultural reference, a pop icon that they didn't know. Why would they, right? And so he then realized he had dug himself into a hole and he had to get out of that hole. So he continued to explain, Heston Blumenthal, have you not seen? He's really good at making different British dishes like trifle. And they all looked at him and said, what's trifle?
What's trifle?
And then he started to describe trifle. And he says, it's got cake and it's got jelly. And they went, what's jelly? So that hole he dug for himself got deeper and deeper and deeper. As you can tell, most of these issues are not grammar or vocabulary related. They are basically because those students didn't have the same cultural reference points. They didn't eat jelly. They didn't know what trifle was. They didn't know who this Heston Blumenthal was. And that is not an issue with their language. But ask any of those students in the class and immediately they are likely to say, oh no, it was my English. I need to study more English. Then I would understand him more. Not realizing that actually it was him who needed to be more aware of, the references he was making and the knowledge his audience had or didn't have.
Okay,
and that,
so
I think it's communication skills. It comes back to communication skills.
Yeah, and I want to bring it back round to that as well a bit later. So, but was this all the stuff that you were sort of discovering when you discovered ELF for the first time? Or was that stuff that happened later? Because I know that ELF has gone through like quite a lot of changes during. So, at the beginning it was very features based. People were looking at the grammar and the pronunciation and the vocabulary and how people were speaking and using grammar and using vocabulary. And it's shifted a lot more towards other things like, cultural awareness and strategies. So when you were studying it, when you were doing your master's, where were we on that sort of line?
We were fairly near the beginning, not completely at the beginning, but there was still a lot of talk at that time about vocabulary and grammar. The question of what should we teach, what shouldn't we teach? That was where ELF was at that time. There was a question of, do we teach the third person S? If we know that most non-native speakers, even very advanced level non-native speakers, might continue to say he want and not he wants, and dropping that S makes absolutely no difference to the meaning, then why spend time teaching it?
Right.
And I remember feeling a bit upset by this, like you're messing around with basic rules of a language. And I can imagine teachers listening to this podcast right now might be feeling the same. They might be saying, but what? It's a third person S. How can you mess with that? And then my instant reaction was, okay, it might not change the meaning, whether you say he want or he wants. It might not change the meaning, but what about the impression you were making?
Right.
Okay. So that was my thesis. It was all about the impression you are making. So I started to focus in my thesis on polite requests. Now in ELT, we teach how to teach students to say, could I have a cup of tea? I was wondering if I could have a cup of tea. If you don't mind, could you make me a cup of tea, etc. And of course, going by that logic, the ELF logic, then, why bother if intelligibility, being understood, is the only thing that matters? Then why not just go around saying, cup of tea?
Give me tea. Yes.
Or doing it, give me tea, or tea, please,
I want tea.
And so I said, surely intelligibility isn't the only issue. There is also impressions that you're making. Are you making the right impression with your English? And we don't want students to be understood, but they're being thought of as rude or abrupt or unprofessional. So I went into
this is sort of, sorry to interrupt. This is pragmatic awareness, isn't it?
Totally.
This is So
my research for my dissertation was totally into pragmatics and discourse. And I went through quite a large-scale piece of research where I was working at International House London, and the managers at the reception desk, very kindly allowed me to place recording devices to record everyone that came in for a period of 2 days and made requests. I then had to kind of go through about 12 hours of recorded dialogues of there were people like students who came to the reception asking for things, asking to see a teacher, for example. There were people, passerbys that walked off the street, both native and non-native speakers, who would come in and ask about a course, about what they were offering. And I had that all on record. I would then transcribe every single request I heard and then categorize them into different types of requests, categorize them into native, non-native speakers, etc. Although the school I was using was in London, the reception desk, most people at the reception desk were non-native speakers. They were Japanese, Norwegian, etc., etc.
Is this the one in Piccadilly, near just down from Piccadilly?
Yes. It's not at Piccadilly anymore. They've moved to Covent Garden.
Okay, I did my CELTA there.
Right. So did I.
Yeah, cool.
So, interestingly, as I was doing this research, I was almost thinking, I'm going to be proved right that impression does matter. How you say things does matter. And I then took the recordings of, I categorized the requests. I put them into like 8 categories. And then I presented them to a focus group of native speaker teachers, native speaker students, non-native speaker students, non-native speaker teachers. And then I got the results based on interviews and also on survey results. Like I had a questionnaire written out. But what was really interesting, I'll start with the native speaker. What was really interesting was the native speaker teachers. One of them, at least, I thought represented the group well by saying, what? He asked to see this person by just shouting their name out. For example, someone approached the reception desk and said, Maria, I want to see Maria. Director, Maria. The teachers were appalled by this particular request. They were like, have we not taught them to say, could I see Maria? Or could you please put me in touch with Maria? But instead, all that came out was Maria, director, Maria. And they were, understandably marking this person down, saying, they're creating a very bad impression. These were the native speaker teachers, right? Okay. Interestingly, when non-native speaker, both teachers and students, when they were interviewed, they didn't say that at all. Instead, they said, this person clearly has a lower level of English, or this person was clearly nervous. So
they were more sympathetic.
They were more willing to take the context into consideration. Maybe this person, maybe they were smiling and we can't see it because it's a recording. Maybe their body language said a different thing. And one particular teacher, I remember quoting, saying, I remember what it was like when I was a beginner at English. I remember being really nervous. I could say something really well in class, but when put in a real life situation, I would freeze up. And then what came out of my mouth was completely not what I had prepared to say. Yeah. Perhaps this person was experiencing that. They
Everyone gets that when they're learning a language, don't they? You're saying it in your head 100 times, and you try to say it out, and then it's just one word.
Exactly. And I've done that in German, and I think if you've had the experience of learning and trying to use a foreign language, you might be more sympathetic. And which is why earlier we said, monolinguals are sometimes quite guilty of not being sympathetic or understanding ELF as a concept because they've never been in that situation. And also, if you believe that what you teach is what students learn, then perhaps, you might go down the wrong route, because we all know that what we teach is what we teach. What students actually absorb is a totally different thing. And then what they can then produce in a real life situation with other things being considered like nerves and the context. What we teach is not always what is then subsequently produced. And, non-native speaker teachers and students seem to understand that. And they were much more sympathetic. And I've looked into research ever since. Recently, I was reading some research about intonation. Native speakers, for example, can be much more harsher when judging someone's intonation. And I was at the receiving end of this when I first arrived from Singapore some 25 years ago. And in Singapore, when we speak English, although it's our first language, we tend to put the stress on the last word of a sentence. So I remember living in a house share, and I was trying to get my housemates to take the rubbish out because I kept being the one that took the rubbish out days and days on end. So I said to my housemate in a strong Singaporean accent, "Can you take the bin out, please?" And the following day, I overheard them talking about me and saying that I was being very rude. And that I was fake, and I couldn't figure out why. At that time, I wasn't a language teacher. I wasn't into linguistics, so I was very upset and hurt by this. So I thought, if I just phrase my request differently, maybe they'll be less judgmental of me. So I went there the next day. I went to the kitchen the next day, and I said, "I was wondering if you can take the bin out, please."
Uh-oh.
So the words were different. I thought, hey, I was wondering. It's polite, right?
Yeah, like what your teachers taught you, or what you're supposed to say,
but no,
according to books.
Because to them, my intonation saying the bin out, please, the heavy stress on the last syllables did not go down well. And I bet they don't even realize it was the intonation. Just instinctively, when you hear that as a native speaker, you think, oh, this person's being very aggressive. But if I said those same sentences to an Indonesian person, a Malaysian person, a Singaporean person, they would not have taken it that way at all. Okay. And so intonation is an interesting one. We start to misunderstand people without even realizing why we've misunderstood them, without realizing that actually intonation is very dependent on your first language, on your culture, and how you interpret it is so highly dependent on these things. And it was many years later when I was doing my MA, when I heard about this researcher called Gumpus. I'm not sure if you've heard of him.
No, I don't.
Gumpus.
John Gumpus. No, I don't know this one. Oh, hang on.
In the 70s, he was a psychologist and academic. And in Heathrow Airport in the UK, in London, they were having some problems between the relationships between the baggage handlers and the cafeteria ladies. They had got these new cafeteria ladies who had come in from India and Pakistan, and there they were serving them their lunches. So Gumpus was brought in because apparently those two groups of staff were not getting along, and it was becoming a real issue.
Wow.
The baggage handlers thought the dinner ladies, the cafeteria ladies, were very rude and aggressive. These cafeteria ladies thought that the baggage handlers were discriminating against them because of the color of their skin. So they brought John Gumpus in. This was in the 1970s, and Gumpus sat down at the cafeteria and just listened and watched the interactions. And he just came back and said, it all boils down to one word: gravy. Because when the British cafeteria ladies offered them gravy, they said, "Gravy? Gravy?" When the new cafeteria ladies offered them gravy, they said, "Gravy, gravy." This downward intonation, just a bit like my experience with "Can you take the bin out, please?"
Yeah, it's the same type of thing.
Yeah, it's the same type of thing. And the moment he noticed that, and the moment this information was shared with the staff, that realization immediately lifted the issue, because then the baggage handlers realized, okay, they were not being aggressive. It's just the accent. And the dinner ladies, the cafeteria ladies, then realized, okay, they were not discriminating against us because of the color of our skin. It was just what the intonation they were used to, how a word was, they're used to the word being said in a particular way. And just that realization solve the problem. And I always say, self-awareness and reflection goes a long way.
Yeah, I love stories when linguistics save the day somehow. No, that's a really cool story. I didn't know about that one. That's an excellent anecdote.
But that goes to show you that, in situations like that, and there's a lot of research done in the last decade that showed, in terms of intonation, that native speakers might take offense when a non-native speaker says, "I don't agree," in that way. Whereas they've found that non-native speakers don't take offense when each other does that, because they are taking the context into consideration. They are almost giving them a discount, because they're saying, okay, it's not your native language, so I'm going to clarify what you really meant by that. I'm not going to make assumptions that you mean it to be aggressive.
So even if in their own sort of first language linguistic environment, like it's also not polite just to go Maria, or if it's also not just polite to go gravy, but they still recognize that it might be okay in other linguistic environments.
Or they might just simply recognize that, hey, it's not your first language, it's not mine either. So we just kind of give each other a wider berth. And we accept that misunderstandings can happen. So I think that importance, again, of clarifying. If you're not sure, don't assume. Clarify. What did you mean by that? You know, did you really? Were you upset with me there, or what was that?
So yeah, in a way, it's a kind of solidarity, isn't it?
Yeah, I suppose. Because
you recognise the same sort of struggles. They're non-political struggles, but there's still some sort of like struggle. Yeah.
But you see, this is where native speakers, especially native speaker teachers, might, find that they are becoming the outsider in this issue and might get perhaps offended or upset. And to which I say, this is not an issue of just, it's not just an issue of native, non-native. It's an issue of understanding and non-understanding of the problem. And I know a lot of native speakers who are also great communicators. Similarly, I also know native speakers who are not. But the native speakers I know who are great communicators are great because they understand the struggles of people using English when English is not their first language. They understand the need to tone down perhaps some of the idioms that have heavy cultural references. They understand that they need to clarify more. They need to make less assumptions about things because it's different from talking to your own friends in a pub, for example.
Right.
They learn to code switch in that way, which brings me to a totally different story.
Okay.
There was, I wish I knew his name now. You probably know his name. A football coach.
No, I would not know his name.
No, not a football fan. There was a football coach who went to Holland to become the coach of their team, a football team in Holland. And then during his stint in Holland, he did an interview, I think, with the BBC. And during the interview, he clearly had a different accent. So his years in Holland had made him used to speaking more slowly, perhaps emphasizing certain keywords more, perhaps using words that were less idiomatic. So his way of speaking was, I don't want to say less British, but perhaps more elf.
More elfy, yeah, I was going to say.
More elfy.
Well, I've found that completely for myself as well. I mean, when I go back to Britain, I'm shocked by how unclear all my friends are and how vague they can be. But also, I'm kind of really happy that I've become quite an unusually good communicator among like my peers back in the UK because of communicating in an international environment.
Yes, the practice you've got.
Half my life, yeah.
But you know what was really interesting about that football coach was if you look at the YouTube video and then look at the comments below the video, it was shocking to see the number of British people who didn't understand why he was speaking in this way. Understandably so. People perhaps who don't have experience with international communication and who reacted really badly to this. They were saying, oh, what's wrong with him? Has he forgotten where he's come from? And this is a joke. Why is he speaking like that? Oh, he's trying to be Dutch. Isn't that funny? And, people who just completely didn't realize that, he's gotten used to this way of speaking because he was trying to be better at communicating. And of course, if you don't have experience with communicating internationally, then you just see this as an issue of losing your identity.
Well, this is actually brings up something I hadn't planned on talking about, but I think this is a really cool point because you can, it's conceivable, I'm not saying this is how it works, but that you can conceive of a sort of a line where you have communication at one side and sort of cultural solidarity or cultural empathy with your own culture on the other. I mean, if you consider that language can be seen to fulfill two purposes, one being to just state, give information or request information, and the other to kind of bond with people and to create sort of relationships based on background and mutual things people have in common. If I meet a British person in a non-British environment, my accent might suddenly shift and become a lot more British. And what I say, I might be saying stuff that's not about giving information. It's just about, forming a bond with someone, because we both know Peep Show and we both know whatever, like British sitcoms or something like that. So we have these,
and we code switch like this all the time. We do this all the time, don't we? I mean, identity is not a thing that exists in as just one solid state. Identity is a very fluid concept. We have multiple identities, right? When we speak to our parents, we speak in a particular way. When we meet our friends at the pub, we might change the way we speak ever so slightly. When we're in a job interview for, a very important formal job, we might then again speak differently. And so to say that, someone can only speak one way because they are from this place and they have to keep their accent, sure, you can keep your accent, but you can have variations of that accent, if that makes sense. And I think embracing that and understanding that, hey, so when we speak with people from an international context, we need to be aware of certain factors. And when we are speaking with friends in a pub, then, we can speak in a slightly different way. We can talk about those cultural references. And
I guess what a lot of these people commenting don't sort of seem to understand is that you don't have to sacrifice one for the other. You can just shift along that line.
Absolutely. And a good communicator is someone who shifts along that line comfortably. Right.
And more extensively, I suppose, and being able to go further in either direction.
Yeah. And all that comes with practice. Like you said, you spent some time in Bulgaria, you communicate internationally all the time. And so you've got used to, the things to look out for, the kind of language to use and not to use, for example, your pronunciation, the way you connect your speech, all those things that you've become aware of that someone who, say, isn't a teacher and is monolingual and has not been communicating interculturally might not notice these things.
And it's very difficult when you're starting to start communicating internationally if you're not used to it. I think it is quite a challenge for some people.
Well, I've been doing a few things with native speakers, so that there is quite a demand now among corporations that have to work internationally to train their native speakers up, to get them ready for communicating in English, but in an international context. So recently I was at a firefighters conference. This was before the pandemic happened. And I presented my concept and sort of a course on helping native speakers become more effective international communicators. And there was such interest in this topic. Firefighters and chiefs of associations were coming up to me talking about how important this is, because, hey, if you're evacuating a concert hall of thousands of people, and if you're making an announcement with the assumption that everyone understands British English just because they're in Britain, and if you have that concept or that idea that, hey, you're in Britain, you should understand British English, then what if there are, say, 20 people in that concert hall who actually doesn't understand? Are you willing then to then say, well, they should then die because they couldn't understand the idioms I was using, or they couldn't understand the collective speech I was using? In a firefighting situation, you can't. Everyone's lives are just as important as each other. And so the way you communicate with every single individual, whatever their background is, has got to be really, really clear.
Leave the building is much clearer than vacate the premises, for example.
For example, absolutely. I had a student who was complaining to me. They were at border control at Heathrow, coming in after a holiday, and someone said to him, "Oh, so you're going to be in England for the next 6 months. How are you going to occupy yourself?" And he just thought, how am I going to occupy myself? What does that mean? Now, this person is an advanced level English speaker, but I think the custom officer didn't realize how idiomatic the phrase "how are you going to occupy yourself" is, because he's so used to, you would think that he deals with international passengers all day long, he would know this, but clearly not.
Because it takes years. I mean, speaking like as a teacher, it takes years to get used to that as well. So, and that's just of pure grading. So I guess customs officer has a lot of jobs, and only some of it would involve grading his language or needing to grade his language.
His language. And I think that there needs to be an openness as well. You need to be open to feedback, right? And feedback might be direct feedback that someone's saying, hey, I don't understand you. That's feedback. But feedback can also come in the forms of having terrible experiences with misunderstandings, experiences with miscommunication and people not doing what you ask them to do. And then that feedback tells you, hold on a second, is it me? Is it because I was really unclear? And then you learned that if you want to get things done, especially in business English, you see this all the time, it goes past, basic grammar and lexis. It's about getting things done. And if my message, albeit grammatically correct, if my message is going to be misunderstood, it might cost my company hundreds of thousands of pounds or dollars. And so clear communication becomes number one priority, not the grammar, not the lexis, but clear communication. And if grammar and lexis comes into making it clearer, sure.
Yeah.
But other things do too. Communication skills should be high up there in getting the message across clearly.
Okay, yeah, this brings me to one of the questions I've got. At the last IATEFL conference, it's a big English teachers conference for those listening who don't know that, in Liverpool. When was that? Oh my God, it was a year ago now. More. But I went to this interesting talk. It was in one of the smaller rooms, and it was all on the passive and the crazy behavior that surrounds the passive tense and ergative verbs and all sorts of stuff. And I found it really interesting. It was really fascinating. I learned a lot about how the passive isn't just the passive, is this weird creature with its own behavior. And if you start, applying certain logic to it, it doesn't work anymore. And it was a really interesting talk. And he was just revealing the complexity of a very small feature, defined feature of language. The guy was Jonathan Marks. He was not particularly, I don't think he's particularly massively known, but it was a fantastic talk. And I went up to him afterwards, and he was saying that there used to be a lot more talks at conferences about how the language worked, and there's much less of that now. And I think one of the reasons I was attracted to that particular talk was because it was so deep into the features. It was very much about language, a whole talk on one language feature. And I thought that was kind of interesting because it stood out, because a lot of the rest of the conference was about all sorts of other things, various sort of soft skill directions, and lots of things, to be fair, but nothing quite so. No, I don't have the right word for it. I want to say descriptive, but that's kind of a different thing. But yeah, I mean, do you think, and I think this sort of mirrors ELF a little bit as well, because, as we discussed, ELF started off very technical, didn't it? It started off looking at phonology and the way things are pronounced, and then, grammatical features and linguistic features, and then moved more and more into this sort of communicative side, which is where you find yourself now. And I want to talk more about that in a bit as well. But I'm just wondering, could it be possible that in the industry as a whole, as well as in ELF, that should we be leaving this other side behind? Do you think this is a sort of evolution away from something? Or do you think there can be this sort of two wheels turning at the same time within the industry? I don't know. I don't know the answer, and I don't know how I feel about it. But it's an observation, I think, that I've sort of noticed, that we're looking at that side, the technical side of things, a lot less than we used to. And is this a bad thing, do you think, or is this cool?
I see. This is where I kind of beg to differ. I think we will never leave. We won't be able to, and we will never leave the side, the grammar, the lexis, the pronunciation features, the nitty-gritty of descriptive, prescriptive grammar. We will never leave that, because that, in essence, to a lot of teachers out there, is the foundation of English language teaching. You learn to speak a language by learning the system of how the language is organized, in other words, grammar, by learning the words that fill those slots, and the collocations and the functions of those words and the meaning of those words, vocabulary. And then we need to say those words, pronunciation, and those are key to speaking a language. So no, I don't think we'll ever leave that. And interestingly, I have to say, when anyone does a talk at any of these conferences about grammar, that room will undoubtedly be filled to the max. I have proof of this because several years ago, I say several years, quite a few years ago, I did a talk at ITEFL called Systemic Functional Grammar.
Oh, cool. Is this Halliday's?
This is Halliday's Systemic Functional Grammar. It's a look at grammar that is very different, a system of grammar that's very different from the way most ELT course books deal with grammar. I studied it when I was doing my MA for one of the modules, got really, really interested in it, kept wondering why we don't do more of this in ELT, and decided to do a talk at ITEFL, thinking nobody's going to be interested in something so technical and so dry. And my room was so filled with people sitting on the floor, standing up, sitting on drain pipes. It was mad. I don't think I've ever had my room so filled before.
Cool.
And, the same thing goes with publications. I often joke that if you write a grammar book, that's going to sell better than any other book on methodology or, life skills or soft skills. Because essentially, I think teachers, native and non-native alike, probably are least secure about these technical facts, these technical side of teaching. When it comes to soft skills, the word soft kind of describes how we feel about it, doesn't it? It's sort of airy-fairy, kind of nebulous. What is this thing? Can you even define? Can you even assess soft skills? You can't, because it's not a tick boxy thing. You can't say someone is correct or wrong, because soft skills by its very nature is not about being correct or wrong. It's about improving the way you do something, right? Whereas with grammar and lexis, that's that comfort of something being black or white, right or wrong, and teachers don't want to be wrong.
Well, I agree with, I don't know if you made that point in there, but it's a dangerous area to think in that way as well, like whether things are right or wrong, of course. And this is something I think English as a lingua franca as a field has really, really explored, whether it's focusing on features or whether it's focusing on sort of communicative abilities.
I think the issue you mentioned about ELF perhaps mirroring this move away from grammar and lexis, I think they are slightly different things. So I think in the early days of ELF, where the focus is on, if you look at all the non-native speakers using English as a lingua franca, what commonalities are there? Oh, they all tend to drop the third person S, for example, or they all tend not to pronounce the TH sound, instead substituting it with something else, which even some native speakers do. They tend to, for example, use prepositions a bit more loosely with more creativity, for example. And these things became the subject of a lot of debate. Pronunciation features like connected speech, the schwa, the weak form schwa, which in a lot of situations can cause more problems with intelligibility. Saying T for two as opposed to T for two is more likely to be misunderstood in an international context. So these issues were brought up in the early days of ELF, and a lot of teachers who disagreed sort of hung on to these concepts, saying, but we can't possibly teach students the wrong thing. We can't teach students to say he want instead of he wants. We can't teach students to say going to and ignore the fact that most people actually say gonna. What if they watch a television program and they hear gonna? They're not going to understand it, for example. So these very, very valid arguments came from teachers. And then as time went on, they realized that perhaps there is no such thing as one kind of ELF. There is no such thing as all the non-native speakers of the world all using English in the same way.
Right.
They don't, right? There is no one variety of ELF. Perhaps a group of Southeast Asian non-native speakers might come together and use English in a particular way. Perhaps a group of Scandinavians might come together and use English in a completely different way from the Southeast Asian speakers. perhaps a group of business people might use English in a very different way from a group of friends who are using English. So they realized that instead of one variety of elf, there are different types of elf. So terms like BELF were created. BELF stands for Business English as a foreign language. Business English as a lingua franca. And then there were like Scandinavian elf and Southeast Asian elf, and and then people start to realize perhaps elf is a fluid concept, because when two people come together, let's say you are a Bulgarian speaker and I am a Chinese speaker. And when we come together, whose elf do we use? You know what? We create our own elf. We accommodate each other. I try to figure out what you're saying and accommodate to your version of English. And you listen to what I'm saying and you try to accommodate me. And in that process, in a very dynamic, fluid sort of way, we are creating our own version of elf.
This really ties into, I've been reading a little bit, and I'd love to do a podcast on it at some point, desegregational linguistics. They're embracing the fluidity of language as a whole, and they're saying that no language exists. I mean, they're quite radical, and there's no such thing as English. There's no such thing as French. Everything is completely fluid, and you can look at a grammar feature like going to, for example, and every single instance in the world ever of the use of going to is slightly different from the other one. So, when you used going to just earlier with me, the precise nature of that reason for using going to and all the signals and the context that surrounds that is not the same as the last time I used going to, for example.
That's not going to make our job as English teachers very easy, is it?
No, it's kind of making it more difficult. But I mean, yeah. But this, in a way, is probably how people felt about elf when it first came out as well. It's not making their job any easier.
As humans, we want to categorize things. We want to put things into nice, neat boxes. I mean, earlier you were talking about a talk about the passive voice that you attended, and you went really deep into the different uses of the passive voice. But look at any course book dealing with the passive voice, and you're going to see a sort of a blanket rule that at the back of your mind as an experienced teacher isn't necessarily true, right? We tell students rules that probably was made up by the very first grammar book written 20 years ago, and then every book since then has been copying Raymond Murphy, for example. And then you realize, hang on, we say there are 3 conditionals. Are there really 3 conditionals? Because some linguists say that there are 21 conditionals or more. The same thing goes with, say, passive voice. Why do we use the passive voice? Every course book says we use the passive voice when the doer of the action is less important. Is that really true? No. But we hold on to convenient rules, convenient concepts, because we need to convey something simple enough so that students can hold on to it. And that there's a lot of argument to be, there's a lot of benefits of that. It's, we do come back in the end and say to students, there are lots of exceptions in English, when the truth is there are no exceptions in English. You were just teaching some simplified nonsense in the first place. Right.
And this is Mike Lewis talked about this a lot.
Yes.
Have you read The English Verb?
I love The English Verb.
1984 book. My God, that blew my mind.
I love
if there are exceptions, then it's not a rule.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And in the English Verb, he talks about remote tenses and near tenses. So instead of calling them past and present, why not call them remote and near? And for a long time, I was obsessed with this concept. And I was going into classes telling students to forget everything they've ever learned about grammar and labeling them with remote and near tenses. And it in a one-to-one situation when I'm teaching students face-to-face, it worked because I was passionate about the concept and they got it. And then I thought, every single course book needs to relabel the tenses.
Well, that's how I felt as well. I still kind of feel like that. But then, I understand
now that I write materials, and now that I'm on the other end of things and writing, materials for course books and things like that, I start to see that, hey, sometimes it's really hard to radically change things that have been done a certain way, because students and teachers have an expectation. And when they see something that is radically unfamiliar, the first reaction is going to be rejecting it, because I'm not there. I can't be there face to face with every single teacher, every single student to coach them through this. So instantly, if they see a material that they're not familiar with, they're going to just reject it. And so perhaps it's easier to do something, albeit not entirely accurate, but simple enough for someone to grasp, if that makes sense.
Yeah. This is the dilemma we are in as teachers, and I think it's also, I think this all still relates to ELF in one way or another, because it's we're torn between being prescriptivists and descriptivists. It's impossible to teach as a pure descriptivist, as somebody who only sees the language as how people are using it. It's practically impossible to give students useful rules and terms that they can actually take home and study. By just saying, oh, people say all sorts of things. That doesn't really help anybody.
Totally.
And I think with ELF, we have this sort of dilemma a little bit as well.
Yeah. Have you heard of Danny Norrington Davis? He wrote this really good book about grammar. And in it, he suggests teaching grammar in a way that doesn't prescribe. So to avoid sentences like we use the present perfect to etc., or the present perfect is used to etc., he suggests that instead we should get students to see the reasons for the usage of certain forms. For example, offering them a text and say, okay, why is the writer using the present perfect in this sentence? In this context, in this sentence, he is choosing to use the present perfect because, and he gets students to figure it out for themselves by looking at the context, by looking at the text, and creating their own grammar reasons. So he takes the word grammar rules and changes it to grammar reasons. And in the book he wrote is called From Rules to Reasons.
From Rules to Reason by Danny Norrington Davis. Okay.
It's excellent because it totally takes what we do. It's not radically changing anything, but it's saying, hey, perhaps we need to get students themselves to become the observers, to describe the grammar they see, rather than seeing the teacher as this fountain of knowledge prescribing grammar rules. Get students themselves to notice things and say, okay, so Gabriel, he used the passive voice in this particular context to express that the doer is not important, or to express that the process is what's important, etc., etc.
To make a joke or whatever.
And I think that is a real.
That's nice. It's
nice
like what
way of looking at it.
What is the language signaling? Not what is it like technically doing? What is it signaling? What are the reasons for something? Yeah.
After all, what is language if not for the purpose of communicating? And so if we ignore the user's intention, the speaker's intention, if we ignore the context and just learn rules for the sake of rules, then language isn't going to be that useful, unfortunately.
Yeah, it's better to learn physics instead if you're going to do that, because it works. Works with that mentality. Yeah, totally. This is great. Thanks for the recommendation. That's a good recommendation. Rules
are easy and rules are convenient. And if we've taught the same rules for years on end, to suddenly then be told that rule is not so important, coming back to ELF, might really offend some people. So what I say to that really is, I'm not saying teach students to drop the third person S. I'm not saying that. I'm not saying teach students to say he want instead of he wants. I'm saying prioritize the precious classroom time you've got. If students are coming into your English lesson for 2 hours every week, that precious 2 hours a week, what are you going to spend those 2 hours on? Are you going to allow them lots of practice to discuss and to use that English? Or are you going to spend half of those 2 hours doing gap fill exercises to get them to get third person S right?
Yeah. And it's
I think it's about prioritizing.
And it's not just a question of simply correcting them and then they know it, because as we all know as teachers, some things take ages for students to get, especially ones that don't seem to be very useful, like the third person S. And I was reading somewhere that articles are a strange phenomenon, and the, because despite the fact they're ostensibly one of the simplest elements of language, they are one of the very last things that students get right. I'm using inverted quotes again here, that, you have advanced students who are still tripping up on using articles. So it's not just a question of, like a couple of minutes of classroom time. This is constant correction from elementary up to advanced.
So I think then the question comes back to priority. So the teacher who's choosing to correct, what do you choose to correct? Do you correct that particular vocabulary item that could really cause a misunderstanding? Or do you correct the third person S or the use of articles?
Exactly. So yeah, I like that you brought it up that a complaint or a criticism rather is that they say, oh, we're supposed to teach them bad English. It's not that. It's just that we prioritize our corrections.
Exactly. We
Is that
prioritize how
a
we
fairer
spend our
point?
students' time,
Yeah,
and focus that time on things that would really make them good English speakers, good communicators,
communicators.
rather than, the nitty-gritty of grammar items that might or might not really matter all that much. Now, of course, the caveat is, what if my students are taking an exam?
Oh yeah,
I
the
get that a
exam. They
lot.
always ruin everything, don't they? Exam.
And that's where I say perhaps exams need to
Yeah.
change. And they are. If you look at some exams like IELTS, all exams have their goods and their bads, the pros and the cons. But we do notice with a lot of these exams, like the Cambridge Main Suite, the IELTS exams, they are trying more and more to focus on the communicative aspect, the how competent are you at getting your message across, more so than, are you getting every single grammar item right. Of course, it doesn't hurt to get the grammar items right, but to focus actually on the communicative aspect
Yeah.
rather than, but then you see a lot of other exams, like say the TOEFL exams.
Oh my God.
Exams that focus on multiple choice questions and discrete item testing, where there is a right and a wrong answer, are much cheaper and easier to carry out, because you can simply get a machine to mark those papers because there is a right and a wrong answer. Whereas exams that focus on communicative competence might need a physical human being there to interact with the candidate and to actually see if they are getting their message across. And so
It's a
that
lot of
those are the ones.
training.
It's a lot of training. It's expensive because you need real live examiners to actually be at that location, and it's time consuming. So you can imagine why some exams or exam boards or schools or governments might prefer the multiple choice discrete item type exams. But if they really want those candidates to come out of the exams being able to actually speak and be fluent and communicative with the language, and not just, get their grammar items right, then they've got to really rethink what the exam is testing and doing.
Absolutely. Yeah, I agree 100% with you. Yeah. Yeah, that's the thing. But if they are teaching to one of those exams, you might have to do that third person S stuff. You just might.
You just might.
Yeah.
I think you have to adapt to your circumstances, and I am in no position to say that what I say is the gospel truth for every single teacher in the world. I think every teacher you have parents to answer to, you have government boards to answer to, so I think it's
people
about,
out there.
yeah, it's about blending those things and figuring out what's important to you as a teacher, really.
Totally. I've got another question. I wanted to bring things around. I wanted to start with the feature side and then move on to the communicative side. But what I've liked that's happened is we've just basically covered everything and gone back and forth, which is cool. It's more dynamic. But I did want to ask a straightforward question. Intercultural communication is kind of your main thing right now. Is that a fair thing to say?
Yeah, I would say intercultural communication and communication skills, which is slightly different, but there are lots of overlaps. Yeah,
no doubt. Yeah, but what does that mean to you exactly? Can you simply how would you define it? What kind of examples would you give that illustrate what intercultural communication is as a concept?
I think the moment you're learning English as a foreign language, and the moment you use English as a foreign language, you are already engaging in intercultural communication. Because it is highly unlikely that you're using English to speak to someone of your own culture. Now, let me define culture. Culture isn't just, it could be national culture, like the country you come from, but culture goes beyond that. Culture is the beliefs, the behavior, the attitudes that are held by a group of people. That group of people could share a nationality, but they could share an age group. Like, you would know that your culture is probably very different from your parents.
Right.
A generational gap, you call it. Genders, it could be education background. It could be industries, right? The job that the company you work for, corporate culture, for example, could be different company to company. Industries have different cultures. Even the departments within a company could have very different cultures. Your IT guys might behave and work very differently from, say, your marketing guys or your salespeople, for example. And in real life, outside the business world, we see it happening too. My board gaming friends, I'm a big board gaming nerd. My board gaming friends probably have a very, very different way of relating to each other and talking to each other from, say, my friends in the teaching world, my colleagues in the teaching world, for example. And then again, my friends who I get to know because we are all parents and we get to know each other because of our babies. We again have a different way of talking to each other, different topics of conversation, different communication styles, etc., etc. So I think culture it goes way beyond culture of a country, of a nation, and culture's fluid. So when we talk about culture, we're not talking about this thing that doesn't change. We're talking about something that's dynamic, because cultures of groups are constantly changing as they interact with each other.
Yeah.
So when my interest in intercultural communication came into play, when I realized that culture goes beyond do's and don'ts. It goes beyond categorizing people and stereotyping people in boxes. It's about helping people to adapt to different ways of seeing things, different ways of communicating. Take, for example, turn-taking styles, right? I was talking about the simplistic definition of the rugby style of turn-taking, where there's a lot of interrupting and pushing aside and
so turn-taking, we're talking about like when someone speaks and the next person speaks. The dynamic going on. And the rugby style.
Rugby style. So we interrupt each other lots. We speak really quickly. There's hardly any silences in between our turns. You speak and then I speak and then you speak, and it's all very fast, like a rugby game. And then there is the bowling style, which is quite the opposite. If you think about the game of bowling, you bowl, you speak, and then there's a bit of silence in the middle while I get my ball ready, and then I bowl, and then you wait and you listen, and then the silence again. So some cultures are more used to a bowling style of turn-taking, and some cultures are much more used to a rugby style of turn-taking. Okay. And if those two cultures come together, if they don't understand that this is a cultural issue, they might start to make judgments that are perhaps unfair. So I've had trainees saying, those people, they're so boring. They never have an opinion. They never talk. You can imagine what type of culture they're talking about. They're talking about bowling culture, right?
Right.
There's so much silence. It's so hard to know what they're really thinking.
Of this. Yeah, I had a student and I'd ask him sort of questions, and the silences before he'd answer was so long. And I thought, okay, I'm going to go for a strategy of just letting him get because I thought the silences meant that he was trying to figure out the English and he was trying to get it, get the sentence correct and so on. And after like a while, I thought, okay, I'm going to ask him about this. And I asked him if he was actually collecting his English together. He was like, no, I'm just thinking. Yeah.
And if you're used to a rugby style, you might find that silence in between turns very disconcerting, very disturbing. You find it very uncomfortable to have silence, and then you start to keep talking. You keep talking to fill in that silence, and very soon you're the only person talking in that conversation.
Yeah, because when I told him that, like in sort of at least in British, like most, I don't want to generalize, but in the UK, generally speaking, and he'd moved to Germany, and I said like probably in Germany too, silence is awkward. And he was like really surprised.
No, it isn't.
Yeah, he had no idea at all about that.
And
culture.
Of course, think about the opposite as well. If a person's used to a bowling style of turn taking, and then they come, into contact with someone who is a rugby communicator, they're going to say, without understanding the situation, they might jump to conclusions and say, "Oh, they're so rude. They're constantly interrupting me, and they just won't shut up."
Yeah.
So I think when I once presented this whole idea of rugby and bowling to my class, and we had a really good discussion about it. And I could see some light bulb moments in some of my students who were like, oh my goodness, oh, so that was what it was about. I just thought they were a bit stupid and didn't have an opinion. And it was really good to get that out of the way, to get those judgments out in the open, and to go, oh, right, so we were wrong about this, and to make them more aware that it might just be an issue of communication style.
Yeah, there's so many little things, aren't there, between cultures. And as you said, cultures aren't just national or regional, they're individual and fluid. But yeah, there are so many, I guess. And it takes a lot of patience, I'd imagine, to start getting used to that idea.
I find this absolutely fascinating because my husband is Irish. I'm Singaporean, but I'm now British. I spent most of my adult life as a British person. I've lived in Germany. My kids were born. One of my children is born in Germany. 2 of them were born in York, and we've had a lot of international experience as a couple. And every time I hear stories about intercultural misunderstandings, or even the misunderstandings that happen between me and my husband, they're just precious. They're just great stories. And in my book, I've collated a lot of these stories, and in intercultural training, we call them critical incidents. So a critical incident is a case study. It's a mini case study. It's a bit like, so John met Sunny, and they were talking, and Sunny holds John's hand, saying, let's go there together. If you were John, what would you do? If you were Sunny, what would you do? So little mini stories like that I got from both my real life experiences or stories that my trainees, my clients have told me, my friends have told me, that I've put into little critical incidents with a task, usually a what would you do kind of task. I find these go down really well in the classroom. As a language teacher, they are beautiful speaking practice material, because the moment you have a controversial incident followed by the question, what would you do? Students often jump on the chance to voice their opinion. If I were him, I would do this. No, that's wrong. If I were him, I would do this. And it's wonderful speaking practice, but at the same time, it's wonderful for awareness raising to make you realize that people do things in different ways.
And I guess not just from the critical incident, but also the way that your fellow students are reacting. You can start seeing that there's also their cultural differences that are making you react differently to it.
Oh, absolutely.
Situation. Yeah.
I had a teacher training group once, and we were talking about business cards. And interestingly, I just simply brought up the question, what would you do if you see a business card like this? And I showed them a little critical incident of someone giving a business card, and it said, say, for example, Dr. Gabriel Clark. How would you react to that? And I had different nationalities in my teacher training group, and one person got very upset about this. One of my British trainees, he said, I would never put the word doctor on a business card. It is pompous, arrogant, and he's clearly not a medical doctor. So why on earth would you call yourself a doctor? They clearly, they're just arrogant people, right? And then I had these German teacher trainees who completely disagreed and went, they spent a long time doing a PhD. Why should they not put doctor on the card? And this massive argument started. It was a very interesting debate. And from it, one of the trainees themselves piped up and said, this is exactly what Chia is talking about. We're seeing the world through our very own filters. We think that doctor is totally normal if you've done a PhD to put doctor on your business card. He totally thinks it's not normal. And we're having this big argument only because we're seeing the world through completely different lenses. And this is exactly what Chia was talking about. And it was just wonderful to see them come to this realization that no one is right or wrong. We are all right and we are all wrong. And we need to be sensitive.
That's something I wanted to get to, because talking about all of this kind of made me think of this question I'm about to ask. The more you sort of study this stuff, and the more you see this, and the more you notice this, the more I guess you can see that there are just how different we all are. And I'm wondering, I mean, this could be a very positive thing, but could it also make you feel that we're also isolated from each other? Is there some sort of like, I don't want to bring things to a downer, but can it kind of cause you to sort of consider that, like, we're less united than we first thought we were? Or the upside of that being that when people see the differences and recognize the differences, they can sort of somehow be united in that. Do you know what I mean?
Say,
like,
yeah, I totally know
awareness
what you're saying.
of the fact that we're more different than we thought we might be.
I think it works both ways. I think we are much more similar than we thought we are.
Mm-hmm.
But we are also a lot more different in ways we have never imagined. So like, the story we talked about, intonation, gravy versus gravy. Right, that's not something that a normal person off the street would consider when they're talking to someone. They wouldn't say, oh, maybe he didn't mean it that way because his intonation pattern might be different from mine because he has a different accent. It's not something that normally occurs to people. And so there's a very high risk of misunderstandings due to things that you are not aware of. Mm-hmm. Right? Things that you're aware of, like, when someone clearly has used the wrong vocabulary, pointing to a car and calling it a bus. That is a clear, misuse or mistake, and it's easier to notice those things and go, okay, sorry, you're pointing to that. That's not a bus, that's a car. It's easier to point it out, and so that there is practically zero risk of a misunderstanding if that person is pointing to the car. However, when dealing with more sort of nebulous concepts, more, soft skill related, communication skills related concepts, sometimes, when things can't neatly be put into boxes where we can be told it's either black or white, those are the more difficult things to notice. And because those are more subtle, they are more likely to cause a misunderstanding. And so I think, although I'm making it sound like we are all so different, but it's more about noticing and understanding those differences and being aware of them that can then help us to be more united. Because once we know the potential for misunderstanding, then can we comfortably focus on the things that we do have in common? Does that make sense?
Yeah, it totally does. It absolutely does. Yeah. So intercultural communication is something that can actually bring us together. I mean, it sounds like kind of obvious when you put all those words together, but just this
it's walking into it blindly, isn't it? If you walk into a communication situation blindly, expecting them to speak English like you, with the same intonation patterns like you, with the same turn-taking styles like you, with the same knowledge, assumptions, cultural backgrounds, knowledge of Heston Blumenthal and trifles, if you expect them to have those exact things that you have, then you would be sorely disappointed, because you would realize that that person is not you. And so, we adapt. As I said earlier, we adapt when we speak to our parents, we adapt when we speak to our friends in the pub. Why not adapt a bit further and understand the differences, the possible differences and the risks to miscommunication when we're communicating across cultures, across borders?
Yeah. And this is valuable not just for teachers or students, but for everyone. I think.
No, totally. And when I wrote the book, Successful International Communication, I didn't write it for ELT students or ELT teachers per se. I wrote it for everyone, because I knew that these were skills that were needed, not just in an English language teaching context, but the skills that everyone needs. And even if you have them, there's no harm in being reminded of them once in a while. Yeah.
Because they can be unifying, which is, what the world needs more of always. Cool. That's a really good place to end it. Do you have any comments you want to add? Mention your book one more time, if you like.
No, I think I'm good.
You sure?
Good. Yeah.
International communication.
Successful international communication.
Sorry, Chia. Yeah, successful international communication, available where books are available. Cool. Well, thanks so much for being here. This was such a joy. I got so much out of it, and I hope you did too. And thanks so much.
Thank you. Thanks for having me here. It's been a pleasure.
Cool. Thanks a lot.
And that's it. I warned you it would get philosophical, and it got philosophical. But there's nothing wrong with being philosophical. And if you say the word philosophical enough times, philosophical starts to sound very strange indeed. Philosophical. Anyway, thanks a lot for listening. Nothing much to add. I hope you enjoyed it as much as I did, which is a lot. Come and visit us at clarkandmiller.com. If you're not on our mailing list, do join the mailing list. We're going to have some cool opportunities for free and fun stuff coming up, hopefully in the next few months. Meanwhile, stay safe, be happy, and I will catch you next time. Ciao for now.